This is the part 3 of a 4-part series specific to SQL Server 2008, 2008 R2 end of support. If this is the first one you're seeing, no worries. We'll do a quick recap on 1 and 2 before we get into what we're getting to today with part 3. So just by way of introduction, I am looking after the Microsoft Advisory Services for North America at SoftwareOne. My background, though, is mostly in internal IT leadership. So I'm very familiar with dealing with these types of issues and the impacts it can have on the business and some of the risks involved and the strategy around resolving these. So that being said, let's get right into it. So part 1 was really an introduction to SQL end of support and when is it happening? What does that actually mean? What are my options? All at a high level. And then we really get into what we see as our strategy at SoftwareOne on helping our customers get through this challenge. So there's really 3 steps in our methodology, which I'll get to later. But the 3 parts really explain what that looks like. So the first part is discovery and entitlement. So understanding what you own, what does that mean when you're looking at entitlements? How does that impact 2008 R2 end of support? And then what kind of tools you use to discover your SQL servers, what information you're looking for in those tools, and that type of thing. So now at part 3, we're going to get into some of the licensing, the optimization around licensing, some of the risk involved with end of support, and hopefully we won't go too much in the weeds, and you'll get some good insights into some strategy on how to optimize the licensing, but also in terms of the entitlements and the licensing that you do own, how does that actually impact you when it comes to 2008 and the support? And then finally, part 4, we'll have part 4 on May 9th, and part 4 is going to dive more into the actual remediation. So, are you looking to migrate to Azure? Are you just looking to upgrade your SQL servers? Are you completely transforming? Are you not doing anything? Whatever that remediation strategy looks like, we're going to get into what those options are and get into some detail on how to help you there. Okay, so for today, we'll do a quick recap of end of support. We'll go through some licensing basics, and then right into the 2008 R2 licensing considerations. So how does the licensing actually impact the end of support? Then we'll get into some licensing optimization, so some quick tips, some strategy around how to optimize your SQL licensing, which can be a massive goal for a lot of organizations right now. It's a very expensive line item in terms of Microsoft investment and even overall software investment. Then we'll talk a little bit about risk in terms of end of support and what it means if you do nothing around end of support, and finally next steps. And we'll get into some detail on how we can help you at SoftwareOne. Okay, so quick recap of 2008 end of support. So first of all, the date is July 9th. So July 9th, there will not be any more security patches for SQL 2008 or SQL 2008 R2 server. So this is approaching very quickly, and there's some real concern around what's going to happen after that date. What I can say though is I've talked to an absolute ton of our customers and even just people calling in asking questions, and I have to say the overall feedback is we're going to get to it, or it's just an old application, or we're going to decom that pretty soon, so we're not worried about it. And in general, that's the overwhelming feedback that at least personally that I've seen, just across the board. So what's important to understand is Why do I even care that end of support is coming? And this is really a risk conversation. It's all about risk. So security, from a security patching standpoint, security patch is the number one way that that there's data breaches. And we're talking about databases here. So of course, you know, there's some sensitivity when it comes to data. We're talking about servers that are in a lot of cases a decade old. So that the team that's managing these servers, they may not even be aware of everything that's in these databases. So there's data that is at risk, and in a lot of cases we're not even aware of everything that's involved in that risk. So how is it at risk if it's not public facing, if it's not one of our tier 1 apps, if it's just a server that's, you know, sitting in the background running? Well, if there is a compromise, which, by the way, a lot of people know that end of support is coming, including hackers. So if somebody's looking to compromise an organization or just wreak havoc just across the board, this is a really good way to do it. And I'm sure there's going to be you know, some vulnerabilities that come out after July 9th, and without extended support or without doing you know, something around resolving this issue, there's a good chance there's going to be some big security risks, some security challenges that are out there. And all it takes is some user that's on the network that somehow has access, you know, through the network, whatever their credentials are, to get to one of these servers, and boom, it's done. All they have to do is click on the wrong email or click on the wrong attachment or go to the wrong website, and the risk is there. In addition to that, regulatory compliance. So if these databases have data on them that are bound to any regulatory compliance, so healthcare, finance, there's a lot of different regulatory compliance, and it's only getting worse with GDPR and CCPA and all these new ones that are coming out as well. So regulatory compliance, if you're bound to those different compliance, what'll happen is, if there is an audit, then having outdated software or unsupported software, unsupported databases, surefire way to fail a regulatory compliance audit. Licensing, the risk here is not understanding the licensing or what entitlements that you have. The risk is actually just overspending. So not understanding what rights you have, the different options that you have to resolve the 2008 end of support challenges. It can cost a lot of money to not understand that the right way. And then finally, support. This is in reference to other vendors. So you may have other applications that you have support with today. And once databases start falling out of support, and it's not just databases, but in this instance, when databases fall out of support, then you're at risk of losing support for those, you know, those different vendors as well. So there's a lot of risk when it comes to losing support on databases. Who is this impacting? Long story short here is it's everybody. You know, there's so many organizations running 2008 R2 databases. It's an extremely popular database, and because of the data that we have and the data that our partners have, we know just based on our recent evaluation that there's 43%, and that may be declining now, but 43% as of just in the past few months, 43% of deployed SQL servers are 2008 or 2008 R2. So if your organization has 2008 out there today, you're certainly not alone. This is something we're seeing across the board, and it's something that a lot of organizations are having to address now in a very short time frame to try to get something done before July 9th. Okay, so let's kind of jump into the licensing and some of the optimization tips. So in terms of licensing SQL. This is a very, very complex licensing model, and there's been a lot of changes. The point to this slide is that SQL has changed a lot over time. So this only goes back to 2008, but even if you go back further, 2005 or 2000, there's a lot of changes, not only in terms of functionality, but even additions. And you can see here, just in 2008, of a product that's just now going completely out of support, the differences from 2008 all the way to 2017 now. So the reason why this makes it so complex is when these different products were purchased, depending on if you maintain software assurance or not, could change what rights you have. So for example, back in 2008, the failover rights were just a product right. When you bought 2008, you had rights to have a failover server. Well, now with 2017, if you've maintained software assurance, then you're bound by the latest product rights. So now the current rights are, that's a software assurance benefit. So you can see how, that's just one example, but you can see how all of these different editions and versions, all these different product rights, and whether there was software assurance at the time or not, it creates this massive amount of complexity and also a massive amount of cost. A lot of companies have invested an absolute ton of money in SQL. So there's a significant investment, significant complexity. And of course, features and functionalities have changed along the way too. So that's where, when you start getting into some of the optimization discussions, even just what edition you're running can have a massive impact. So if you think back to, like SQL Server 2005, just to have the ability to do the clustering, you had to have enterprise, and now, for a long time now, since 2012, that's not been the case. Even to have the always on availability group, at this point, you can even use standard and have that capability. So just over time, it's really changed feature, functionality, product rights, additions, everything. It's just changed over time. Makes a lot of complexity. What adds to the complexity is there's a lot of different ways to deploy SQL now, and that's just growing. So SQL, just like everything else, is not exempt to this whole hybrid concept. So there's a lot of scenarios where a hybrid solution makes sense. You may have some databases on-prem. You may start to move some into the cloud. You may start transforming applications. So actually rebuilding applications. So it's using database as a service, and you're actually using Azure SQL, for example, or there's so much that can take place in terms of architecting a solution and how you're actually deploying SQL. Why that matters so much in this discussion is depending on how you've maintained your rights, how you've maintained your licenses, that changes what options you have. So just as an example, with software assurance, you have the ability through license mobility to move your license into the cloud, into public cloud. So with those rights, that changes what the consumption costs would be on virtual machines in the cloud. So for example, you can go into an Azure tenant and you can just spin up a Windows server with SQL Server already loaded on it, and that per second cost, that consumption cost, includes all of the licensing, the Windows licensing, the SQL licensing, everything. Well, if you're migrating a workload from on-prem into the cloud, if you have software assurance, you actually have rights to move that licensing with it. So there's a massive difference in cost of that consumption if you're moving licenses and taking advantage of your entitlements. Okay, not to get into the weeds too much here, but I just wanted to give a couple quick examples of licensing just for those that are completely unfamiliar with SQL licensing. SQL licensing by large is just core based. You can still license SQL Standard with a server CAL, our client access license. But what we're going to do here is focus on core licenses. And the other thing is there's a big difference in what your options are if you're just licensing a physical server versus licensing in a virtual environment. So in a physical environment, it's actually pretty straightforward. First thing to remember is there's a 4-core minimum. So even if this is a 2-core server, and this goes for the virtual environments as well, if it's just a 2-core server, not that many of those exist anymore, but if it is, you still have to license a minimum of 4 cores. In this case, the example shows that there's 2 processors. Each processor has 4 cores, so you're licensing a total of 8 cores. When you're buying SQL licenses, they're actually bought in pairs. So that a lot of times causes confusion when someone says, "Hey, I need to buy 4 2 packs." Basically, what that means is you have to buy it in a 2-pack, and so you're buying 4 2-packs in order to cover 8 cores. So that's where a lot of the confusion comes from, just in purchasing those packs. So physical environment, pretty straightforward. Virtual environment, this is where things can get more complex, and I could talk about this for hours. But of course, we're going to try to fit this into a few minutes here. So at a virtual environment, the reason that you have a lot more options is you can license the physical hosts, or you can license the virtual machines. So the physical hosts, if you're licensing that way, what you have to do is you have to license with an enterprise edition. When you license with enterprise, you have a couple options. You can purchase enterprise without software assurance or with software assurance. When you license the physical hosts with software assurance, that actually gives you unlimited virtualization. So if you're going for really high density, you have a ton of SQL servers, then there's a benefit to doing that, because you can license the physical host, and ultimately through that high density and possibly over provisioning, you can get a really good use case in terms of a financial analysis. In a lot of cases, it makes sense to license the VMs. So if you don't have that really high density of SQL servers, or if you have, let's say, 10 physical hosts in a cluster, and you don't want to segregate the SQL servers, you just want them on whatever host they happen to be on, and servers may move from VMs may move from one physical host to another, then in that case, it may make sense to license the virtual machine as opposed to the physical host. So we do a lot of work around analyzing this, but long story short, in a virtual environment, there are certainly options, and it pays off big time to do that analysis. What I would say is, as time has gone on, there's less and less of a case for licensing enterprise for the unlimited virtualization, because as you start looking at migrating into cloud, or you start migrating out of that cluster, the challenge is your license is bound to that physical host, where when you start to migrate, so let's just say you want to move a server to Azure, like I was just discussing earlier, when you move that and you use that license mobility, you can only do that if that license is actually with that VM, or if you remove one of the hosts from the cluster, for example. So it's very difficult in those scenarios where there may be some of that movement to make a good case for licensing enterprise at the physical host. Another thing I would say is just giving an example. A lot of organizations will look at just paying for the extended support for the 2008 SQL servers, and the big question with that is always, what is it going to cost? and does it make sense for us to go that route, or should we look at one of the other options, which I'll get to in just a minute. But just wanted to give an example, since we have this server here as an example. So this server, it's showing that you would need to license 6 cores. If you had to license 6 cores with extended support, that would be about $40,000 a year. So the extended support is not inexpensive. It's certainly typically a short-term strategy just to get through another year to come up with a solution, but it is an option, and it's an expensive, typically short-term option. Okay, so we've talked about software assurance quite a bit already, and this is just to kind of highlight really what the core components are of software assurance. The important thing to this presentation is a lot of these impact 2008 and 2008 R2 and to support quite a bit because it impacts what your options are. So with software assurance, the first one right off the bat is new version rights. So you can upgrade to any version you want. In fact, you could upgrade to 2012 SQL Server and you're still getting security patches there. You can certainly upgrade to the latest edition with software assurance, and that's a really good option in a lot of scenarios where you're not looking to migrate to the cloud, you're not looking to transform anything, you just need to do an in-place upgrade and start getting that server patched again. So new version rights, really important to have as an option. License mobility, this is one we've already talked about, where license mobility allows you to move that server locally as often as you want. So when we talk about a virtual environment where that VM may move from one physical host to another, you need license mobility rights in order to have that ability from a licensing compliance standpoint. But moving that license to the cloud is also through license mobility, and that right allows you to move that server completely off-prem into public cloud, and that's the only way that you can do that. There is no once every 90 days or anything like that. That doesn't exist without license mobility. Failover for high availability. This is a big one, and this is one of the ones I talked about earlier, how this is different than licensing used to be many years ago. Failover for high availability is where you get one server that's identical to a server that you have live that's just passive. So if you're using always-on availability groups, or if you're using failover cluster instance, that secondary server that is just passive, it's just purely 100% for failover, you don't have to license that. And depending on how the solution's architected, that could save a ton of money because again, the cost of SQL is high, and if that application, if you can cut the SQL cost in half, that's fantastic. So failover is a big one. And then enterprise-specific software assurance. So these only apply to SQL Enterprise. And again, unlimited virtualization, that's speaking directly to licensing a physical environment, a physical virtual environment. So your physical hosts are licensed via SQL Enterprise, and that gives you the unlimited virtualization. You can install standard or enterprise, as many servers as you want on that physical host. Hadoop is another newer software assurance benefit. So the Hadoop machine learning server is part of enterprise server, and Power BI reporting server as well with SQL Server 2017 Enterprise Edition. So there's a lot of software assurance impacts to the 2008 R2 end of support discussions, because that's what gives you your options. Okay, so licensing optimization. So just a few tips. First thing is we always start with a data layer. So whether we're doing compliance, whether we're doing advisory work and consulting, we always start with what we call the data layer. It's very important to know what's deployed. You've got to know the difference between test dev. Do you have your test dev separated? If not, that's certainly a way to optimize. You may or may not be familiar with Developer Edition, which has been free for a number of years now. So there's just knowing the environment is super important. So by data layer, that's making sure that you have a good tool in place. You got to have a good system in place for knowing what you actually have deployed. Then you can look at entitlements. So all of the software assurance benefits that we just talked to, all of the entitlements. So what do you actually own, and apply that to that data layer, what you actually have deployed. And then license models. So knowing what your options are in terms of licensing. So can you, does it make sense to license for unlimited virtualization? Does it make sense to license all the VMs? Maybe a server cal license model with standard edition still makes sense. Whatever it is, understanding the license models and knowing how to apply that best can make a big difference. And then ultimately, some of the biggest optimization methods that we do is performance. So are you looking at logs to see if the application is causing a lot of errors with SQL, and we're just throwing more cores at it or more RAM at it? And when you start throwing more resources at that server, that's more licenses, more cost. So if we can right size servers, then we can lower licensing costs. We can, even if we've already made the purchase, we can eliminate the need to buy new licenses in the future. We can reharvest those licenses and use them for future projects. Consolidation. I realize this isn't a tier 1, tier 2 kind of a optimization plan for your applications, but a lot of times there are a lot of databases out there that have very low utilization, that are just sitting out there, hardly have any transactions, but they're still consuming licenses. It could be physical servers that just haven't been virtualized yet. There's lots of scenarios where consolidation could have a big impact on having to buy new licenses, or even software assurance and maintenance fees that you're paying year over year. And then also ultimately a decommission plan. One of the big mistakes that we see is servers just sit out there and nobody wants to decom them because there's not a good strategy in place to decom them. So we help with that as well. Just having a server in place because it's an old application that we just can't delete the data yet, or things like that. There also can be a combination of consolidation and decommissioning. If there's enough scenarios where, hey, let's consolidate all these databases that we can't delete, we can't get rid of the data yet, we're bound to have access to it for 7 years or 10 years, whatever it is. Let's consolidate those so that the data's there, but we can eliminate a lot of cores, a lot of requirements in terms of licensing. So these are some of the some of the core tips that I would give in terms of optimizing licensing around SQL. And last thing I would say about licensing is I haven't seen a tremendous amount of deployments in SQL environments yet. But what I would say is, Microsoft did see that there's a huge amount of database in Linux, a massive amount. So the number they had was 36% of enterprise databases are in Linux environments, which of course were not SQL. So just in terms of future roadmap and how to license in a Linux environment, you can leverage SQL in Linux now, and the licensing is exactly the same. So the same license that you used in a Windows server can be used in Linux. So if we're rebuilding applications or Again, if there's a potential to reharvest licenses, you can certainly use those in Linux environments and start using SQL in those environments as well. So I have not seen that a lot at this point. So just kind of circling back to risk, and this is where, a lot of times I just hear like, who cares? I'm not worried about SQL and the support. It doesn't matter to me. We'll probably just update it at some point. And this is, just kind of a reminder of things that we've seen in the past. So SQL Slammer, just as an example, this is an oldie. This is back in 2003, I think. And this was the one that actually slowed down the whole internet. It infected DNS servers and just it really took down a lot of networks, and it was just in a matter of minutes. This was a pretty insane one. But again, this was something that Microsoft found 6 months ahead of time. There was patches for it, and everybody just didn't listen. And because this was known, SQL Slammer was created, and that vulnerability was taken advantage of. Equifax is another really good example. Again, unpatched servers. That one was pretty crazy, 140 million users. Marriott, this is actually fairly fresh. That was all the way through 2018, quite a few years that was going on. But 500 million records compromised. Same thing, unpatched servers. So this isn't this isn't meant to scare anybody. It's just reality. It's there's a lot of risk in having databases sitting out there, even if they're not tier 1 apps. Even if it's just some old data that's sitting out there. If there's data sitting out there, it's probably out there for a reason, and there's probably some sensitive data in it. So it's again, unpatched servers are just a major risk. Okay, so what's next? Just to clarify, what are the options? We see this as there's really 4 main options. Of course, there's 100 different ways you can spin this, but we see this as these 4 main options. And again, think of software assurance benefits. That has a major impact. So 1, upgrade. You can take that 2008 server, do an upgrade to at least 2012, but what we're seeing more often than not is just let's bring it all the way up to 2016 or 2017. So upgrade option number 1 there. 2, extended support. Again, this is costly. A lot of times we'll see this in really large enterprises where there's just no possible way that they can get all of the 2008 servers handled one way or another, upgraded or migrated, whatever it is. There's just too many. So again, cost is really high. Just a 6-core enterprise server is over $40,000 a year. So it's a very big cost to do extended support, and it's really just a temporary solution. Next year, you're gonna have to deal with the same thing. Transform, again, this can mean different things to different people, but ultimately, it's removing that 2008 database, by whatever means. That could mean you're moving to PaaS, so you rebuild the application and you're leveraging PaaS in the cloud. It could mean that your transformation is actually a new consolidation strategy. There's lots of things that can mean to different people. Ultimately, it's transforming that database to something else. And then migrate. So this is the one that's interesting. So migrate. What Microsoft has done, and this is pretty smart. They've extended support if the 2008 servers are running in Azure. So there's gonna be cases where an application needs to run 2008 or 2008 R2. There could be features that the application is leveraging that aren't in newer editions. It could be that there's the application hasn't evolved and still requires 2008 or 2008 R2. There's, I hear all kinds of reasons why there can't be an upgrade. So a good solution there is to migrate that workload to Azure, and you continue to get the security patches, so you're not at risk, but you don't have to change the versions or additions. So migrating is a very real option for those servers that that are required to stay 2008 or 2008 R2. So we've talked a little bit about this. This is our methodology, and we look at it as really 3 steps. So I talked about that data layer before. This is something that we absolutely at Software One can help with. So data layer is scanning the environment, looking at the entitlements, deciphering the entitlements. What do they actually mean? What what servers should they be applied to? What's the most cost-effective way to do that? Ultimately, giving a reconciled licensing position. Phase 2 is really a deeper dive into the SQL environment. So again, doing scans on those servers, looking at performance analysis, looking at logging, looking at upgrade path. Are you running features that can't run in newer versions or editions of SQL and things like that? So there's a lot of work that goes into each server to create that roadmap, to create that path, to see what additions, what versions it does make sense to migrate to. And then ultimately also cloud migration. So if those scenarios make sense to you, where we've got to maintain our current editions, our current versions, then we absolutely can help migrate those servers to the cloud. Even if there is no current tenant, we can do the complete setup, and that's where phase 3 comes in. So phase 3 is executing on that remediation plan, executing on what that roadmap looks like. Okay, so that brings us to a close on part 3. So hopefully you're able to capture some good tips on optimization and why licensing is so important when it comes to SQL 2008, 2008 R2. But most importantly, hopefully the idea behind the risk and what the real risk is, and examples. We could have 100 examples up there of organizations that didn't take security patching seriously enough, and hopefully that was a takeaway that we've got to do something about these, and we can certainly at Software One help build that path, build that roadmap to take care of those 2008 servers. That being said, if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer some questions. Danielle?
Yeah, so we do have a couple questions here for you. So the first one is, what if I don't have software assurance?
Yeah, that's a great question. So without software assurance, there is absolutely some limits to what you can do. So if you are looking at transforming, then of course you may not even need the software assurance benefit. So if you're rebuilding the application to leverage paths, or if you are going to spin up a server in the cloud, that gives you the ability to license SQL right through the cloud, and it would just be a new license. If you're going to do upgrades, or if you're looking at migrating the workloads to Azure, it may make sense just to buy new licenses. But ultimately, yeah, that's a great question. Without software assurance, there's limits to what you can do, because it's a point in time product at that point. The same rights just don't exist.
Awesome. And then it looks like this is the last question. We use AWS, so what are the options that we have?
Yeah, so with AWS, it's very similar to options that you would have in Azure. So you can transform, you can do database as a service, you can move VMs into Azure that have SQL on them. You can spin up VMs in AWS that have SQL licensing built into the cost. So there's all those options are the same in AWS. The difference is Microsoft, because they have Azure and they have SQL, they're able to combine the two to give that ability to provide the security patching if you migrate to Azure as opposed to AWS or GCP, for example. So that is the one advantage that Microsoft has, is they can offer that support by migrating there. So that's really the only difference between migrating to Azure versus AWS in terms of licensing, I should say.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. I think that looks like all the questions that we have. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to point out to everyone that we do have a one-pager with more information in our handout section, so don't forget to download that before you sign off. Dan, you can wrap it up.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining, and this will be made available online, so anybody that watches afterwards also appreciate the time. And if there's any questions, please reach out to your contact at SoftwareOne. Thanks.